Hey everybody, I am so glad to have you with me. I am Stacy Sims, the host of what's usually a weekly podcast providing information and inspiration for people with diabetes with a focus on those who use insulin. I am trying something new here, a short newscast full of the top diabetes news of the past week, and that is all types of diabetes. We're going to debut here on Facebook Live and then share on other outlets, including the podcast. The goal here is to get you up to speed quickly and with good information. So I have to tell you before we really jump in that Diabetes Connections in the News is brought to you by Inside the Breakthrough, a new history of science podcast full of did you know stuff. And now let's jump right in. In the news this week, the majority of children with type 1 who tested positive for COVID did just fine. According to the very first report about this from Barbara Davis Center, 77% of children with type 1 who had COVID were cared for at home without complications. The children who were hospitalized were all diagnosed with diabetic ketoacidosis, and the greatest risk for adverse outcomes was an A1C over 9. Fewer than 2% of all those cases required any respiratory support, and no deaths were recorded. Another study about kids and COVID, the incidence of severe DKA among children presenting with new onset type 1 diabetes doubled during the pandemic period compared with 2019, according to data published in Pediatric Diabetes. This research comes from clinics in Canada from March to August 2020 and compared to the same period in 2019. Now, the number of children diagnosed with T1D was similar, but the frequency of DKA went from 45% to 68%. And what they call severe DKA went from 13% to 27%. It more than doubled. Now, speculation here is that fear of COVID kept people out of the doctor's office until it was absolutely necessary. But these researchers say more education is needed around DKA even after the COVID pandemic ends. Bit of a hat tip to listener Chris Wilson for letting us know about this. Dexcom had its first quarter earnings call last week, still expecting the G7 to launch in Europe ahead of the US, with US launch toward the end of the year. We will find out more details about the G7 at the upcoming ATTD conference, that is the Advanced Technologies and Treatments for Diabetes conference. Chief Operating Officer Quentin Blackford also reports that, quote, we rolled out an update to the G6 algorithm in the first quarter. We believe this update will drive further reductions to times in which data is temporarily unavailable, and I've seen excellent results from the initial launch of this updated algorithm in Canada in 2020. I've talked to Dexcom a few times about this kind of thing. They can make changes to the transmitters and the sensors that don't require regulatory approval. No announcement. They just do it at the factory and roll them out. And it looks like this was one of these. Taking a moment to look at some research with type 2 diabetes, a new study suggests that people exposed long term to certain air pollutants may have a higher risk of diabetes. This was part of the ongoing Jackson Heart study, which looks at African American patients in Mississippi. The study included more than 5,000 people ages 21 to 94 in the Tri County Jackson area, where traffic is the major source of ambient air pollution. Levels of diabetes and of pollution exposure were assessed 1 in 3 years prior to visits. They reported a diabetes prevalence of 21% at visit number 1, 33% at visit number 2. 12.5% of those without diabetes at the first visit developed it by the second visit. The results that they got here provide some evidence, the researchers say, that the exposure is linked to diabetes. And apparently, there are very few studies of environmental pollution risk factors in communities of color. So these researchers say a lot more follow up is needed. There is a study to tell you about gestational diabetes. It turns out few women who meet the criteria for early gestational diabetes screening actually receive it. And this study was only done at one location, but the authors say it's indicative of a greater problem. Only 12% of women who met the American College of Obstetrician and Gynecologists criteria for early screening actually received it at a New York hospital. It is recommended that all pregnant women be screened for gestational diabetes at 24 to 28 weeks. Nearly one-fifth of the women who met the criteria for early screening but we're not screened, we're ultimately diagnosed with gestational diabetes further along in their pregnancy. All right, I want to take a quick break here and tell you about our sponsor for In the News. Inside the Breakthrough is a podcast that explores the idea of a eureka moment. It's historical wisdom mixed with modern insight. It's a little bit history, a little bit science. And the latest episode tells the story of Dr. Banting and the discovery of insulin. Every week is a different story. They've talked about snake oil, they've talked about leaded gasoline and crime. But this week has really good information about the discovery of insulin that I'd never heard. Banting had to sell his car to get money to buy dog food. And of course, there's a lot of scientific information as well. Listen to Inside the Breakthrough wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, back to the news now. And one of the pioneers of diabetes technology passed away this week. Helen Murray Free co developed the dip and read diabetes test, a paper strip that detected glucose in urine. She died Saturday at the age of 98. Before the invention of the dip and read test in 1956, technicians added chemicals to urine and then heated the mixture over a Bunsen burner. The test was inconvenient, they say, and because it could not distinguish glucose from other sugars, results were not very precise. Ms. Free and her husband figured out how to get strips of filter paper to turn blue when glucose was present, and the test made it easier for clinicians to diagnose diabetes, cleared the way too for home test kits, which let patients to monitor glucose on their own. And finally, on In the News, big book launch this week. Chris Rudin is out with The Upper Hand, Leveraging Limitations to Turn Adversity into Advantage. Chris is one of our favorite guests, longtime friend of the show. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. Chris was born with 2 fingers on his left hand and a shorter left arm. He was diagnosed with type 1 at age 19. He's a champion power lifter. He's been on the Titan Games. He got a big hug from The Rock. He is out with this new book. Again, it is called The Upper Hand. Congratulations, Chris. And that is our first Diabetes Connections in the News. I'm going to do this for about a month and see what the response is. If you like it, share it. And feel free to send me your news tips, Stacy at diabetes-connections.com. When we finish here, I am going to put the sources and links in the comments. So if you'd like to see that, they will be there. If you're going to be listening on the podcast, it will be in the show notes. And please join me wherever you get your podcasts for our next episode on Tuesday. We're talking to the folks from Zealand Pharmacy about the newest shelf-ready emergency glucagon called Zegalog. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you then.